For millions of viewers, Arthur Fonzie Fonzarelli wasn't just a character, he was confidence, rebellion, and cool wrapped into a leather jacket. He was the reason Happy Days stopped feeling like a family sitcom and became a cultural phenomenon. But one moment changed how the show would be remembered forever. Not because it was shocking at the time, but because years later it came to symbolize something quietly breaking. This is the story of how Fonzie's most famous stunt didn't just redefine a TV show. It rewrote pop culture itself. When Happy Days meant escape, not excess. When Happy Days premiered in January on ABC, America was tired. The country was still emotionally bruised by Vietnam, political scandal, and social unrest, and television audiences were craving something gentler. Creator Gary Marshall designed Happy Days as a nostalgic refuge, a return to the imagined innocence of 1950s Middle America, where problems were smaller, solutions were human, and families gathered around dinner tables instead of televisions blaring bad news. At the center of that world was the Cunningham family. Richie was the emotional anchor, Howard and Marion were stability personified, and Joni represented youth on the edge of growing up. In its earliest form, Happy Days was intimate and grounded, focused on relationships rather than spectacle. Fonzie, played by Henry Winkler, was initially a side character, a neighborhood tough with a reputation, not a superhero. But something unexpected happened almost immediately. Fonzie resonated. Viewers latched on to him not because he was outrageous, but because he felt authentic. He was flawed but loyal, intimidating but kind, rebellious yet deeply moral. Winkler played him with restraint, letting silence and body language do the work. By the second season, the show quietly shifted. Chuck Cunningham disappeared without explanation, and Fonzie stepped closer into the spotlight, becoming Richie's mentor and emotional counterbalance. As the seasons progressed, Fonzie's rough edges softened. The biker became a guardian, the delinquent became a hero. His popularity exploded beyond the confines of the show, spilling into lunchboxes, posters, and playground imitations. By the time Happy Days reached its third season, Fonzie wasn't just stealing scenes, he was driving the series forward. Ratings reflected that shift. The show climbed rapidly, eventually becoming the most watched program on television. Success, however, has a cost. Once Happy Days became the #1 show, expectations changed. The pressure to outdo previous seasons intensified. Simple stories no longer felt big enough for a show at the top. Each premiere needed to be louder, bolder, and more memorable than the last. What began as nostalgia slowly transformed into escalation. And that change set the stage for a moment no one realized would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. The pressure of being #1. By the time Happy Days entered its 5th season, it was no longer just a successful sitcom. It was the most watched show on television. That position came with privilege, but it also came with a kind of creative danger. When a show reaches the top, the question quietly shifts from "is this good?" to "how do we make this bigger?" And that question changes everything. The year before, the series had opened its season with a high-energy 2-part demolition derby featuring the Malachi brothers. It was loud, physical, and designed to feel like an event. The ratings rewarded that approach, and the message from the network was clear. The bar had been raised. A normal episode would no longer be enough. The next premiere had to feel even larger, even more unforgettable. What made this moment especially fragile was how late the decisions were being made. According to Ron Howard, the cast didn't even receive a full script until the last minute. They knew only the broad strokes. The characters were going to Hollywood, and there would be some kind of water skiing involved because Henry Winkler knew how to water ski. There was no long-term philosophical debate about tone or realism. The show was moving fast, reacting instead of reflecting. At this point, Fonzie had become the engine of Happy Days. Writers increasingly treated him as someone who could do anything, fix broken machines with a punch, command respect without effort, and now, apparently, conquer nature itself. From a production standpoint, the logic felt sound. Fonzie had already jumped a motorcycle over 14 garbage cans on national television in a previous season, an episode that had been wildly popular. Escalation felt natural. If Fonzie could do that, why not more? But escalation is a one-way street. Each new stunt doesn't just add excitement, it subtly changes the rules of the world. Happy Days had once asked viewers to believe in emotional truth, not physical spectacle. Now it was asking them to suspend disbelief in a different way. The Hollywood trip itself already pushed the show away from its Milwaukee roots, replacing familiarity with novelty. On set, Ron Howard remembers standing off to the side, sunburned, watching the scene come together. Beside him stood Donnie Most, who played Ralph Malph. As they talked quietly about the script, Donnie leaned in and said something that sounded casual, almost joking. "He's jumping a shark." At the time, it wasn't a phrase. It was an instinct, a feeling that something had just crossed a line no one could uncross. The stunt that became a symbol. The moment itself was designed to feel playful, not catastrophic. Fonzie, dressed in his familiar confidence, steps onto water skis and accepts a challenge from a local beach figure known as the California Kid. A shark waits in the water, restrained in a net. Fonzie flashes a thumbs up, accelerates, and clears the obstacle. The crowd cheers. The episode moves on. At the time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like another win. Behind the scenes, however, the origins of the stunt reveal how accidental the moment truly was. The idea didn't come from a writer's room trying to outdo itself. It came from Henry Winkler's real life. Before acting, Winkler had been an avid water skier and even worked as an instructor. His father, proud and persistent, repeatedly pushed him to tell the producers about this skill. Winkler resisted for a long time, not wanting to seem opportunistic. Eventually, during a casual moment with Gary Marshall, he mentioned it. That was enough. The writers built the water skiing into the Hollywood storyline. Winkler performed the skiing himself, with the exception of the actual jump. Safety concerns and technical limits kept that final moment out of his hands. Still, what mattered wasn't who executed the jump, it was what the jump represented. For the first time, Fonzie wasn't just bending reality, he was breaking it. Years later, Winkler would admit that half of his smile in the scene wasn't Fonzie at all. It was Henry, stunned that the show had actually gone there. At the time, no one on set thought they were sabotaging the series. The ratings didn't collapse. The audience didn't revolt. In fact, Happy Days remained enormously popular for several seasons afterward. And yet, something had shifted. The show had crossed from character-driven storytelling into symbolic excess. Fonzie no longer solved problems through connection or moral clarity. He conquered them through spectacle. That change didn't ruin Happy Days overnight, but it altered how the show functioned. Once a character can jump a shark, there is nowhere left to go except further away from reality. That is why the moment lingered. Not because it was ridiculous, but because it marked the instant when escalation replaced restraint, and television quietly took note. How a single scene turned into a cultural verdict. For years after it aired, the shark jump existed in an oddly quiet place. Happy Days kept producing episodes. Characters rotated in and out. The series eventually concluded after a long, commercially successful run. The water skiing stunt wasn't treated as a scandal or a breaking point at the time. It lived on as a piece of trivia, something fans remembered as strange, maybe excessive, but not especially meaningful. Television moved on. So did most of the audience. That changed far from Hollywood, not in a writer's room or a board meeting, but in a college dorm. A University of Michigan student named Sean Connolly began using the phrase "jump the shark" in casual conversation to describe a familiar creative disappointment. That moment when a story pushes itself too far and loses the very thing that once made it work. It wasn't a scholarly theory or a critique of Happy Days specifically. It was shorthand, born out of frustration and humor, shared among friends who loved television enough to notice when it betrayed its own instincts. The phrase might have stayed private if not for Connolly's roommate, John Hine. Hine recognized that what they were joking about had a universal resonance. Television history was filled with moments like that, not just from Happy Days, but from countless shows that mistook escalation for evolution. Hine built a website devoted to cataloging those moments, and when it went public, the idea spread instantly. The phrase was simple, vivid, and devastatingly effective. Almost overnight, Fonzie's water ski jump was no longer just a scene. It became the example, the defining case study in creative decline. What made this transformation especially brutal was that many people using the phrase had never watched the episode itself. They didn't need context. They didn't need nuance. The image alone, a leather-jacketed icon soaring over a shark, carried enough absurdity to do the work for them. Those closest to Happy Days pushed back, and not without reason. Writer Fred Fox, Jr. argued that the show had featured far more implausible elements later, including an alien character who landed in Milwaukee and went on to get his own spin-off. Others pointed out that the ratings remained strong for years after the shark jump. Ron Howard himself has said that the moment didn't mark the immediate decline of the series. By the numbers, they were right. But cultural memory doesn't operate on spreadsheets or timelines. It operates on symbols. Fonzie jumping the shark was visual, concise, and perfectly metaphorical. It captured something audiences intuitively understood, the feeling that a story had stopped trusting itself. Once that image existed, it didn't matter what came after. The verdict had been rendered retroactively. The phrase quickly escaped television criticism and entered everyday language. Restaurants could jump the shark when they lost their identity. Relationships could jump the shark when trust was broken beyond repair. Entire film franchises could jump the shark when spectacle replaced substance. And each time the phrase was used, it carried a piece of Happy Days with it, reshaping the legacy of a show that had once simply wanted to make people feel good. In the end, a single scene didn't just define a show, it gave the culture a way to name disappointment. And once disappointment has a name, it becomes impossible to forget. What was really lost after the shark? The real tragedy of the shark jump isn't that it instantly destroyed Happy Days. In fact, the show continued for years afterward, pulling in strong ratings and introducing new characters that briefly kept it afloat. What was truly lost was something far more subtle and irreversible, the way the series was seen. From that moment on, Happy Days was no longer judged episode by episode. Everything that followed was filtered through a single image that audiences couldn't unsee. What once might have been considered a harmless creative risk was now interpreted as evidence of desperation. The show hadn't just changed, it had been labeled. Before that moment, Happy Days existed in a fragile balance between realism and fantasy. It asked viewers to believe in emotional truths, not literal ones. Fonzie fixing machines with a punch or commanding a room with a glance worked because it was rooted in character, not spectacle. After the shark jump, that balance cracked. The writers were no longer rewarded for subtlety. Every new idea was measured against that moment, as if the show had crossed an invisible threshold. Growth became suspect. Evolution became decay. The departure of Richie Cunningham and Ralph Malph later on only accelerated that perception. Richie wasn't just the lead character. He was the moral center, the emotional anchor that grounded Fonzie's larger-than-life presence. Ralph provided contrast, humor, and humanity. When both left, the dynamic that had defined the show's heart disappeared. Fonzie remained immensely popular, but without Richie, his role shifted. He was no longer the mentor or the outsider looking in. He became the center, a position the character was never designed to hold alone. The series tried to adapt, redistributing emotional weight to newer characters who lacked the same history or audience connection. These weren't bad performances, but they were fighting an impossible battle. The show wasn't just changing, it was trying to outrun its own reputation. Ratings eventually dipped, and viewers began to drift away. But by then, the damage had already been done. The phrase, "jumped the shark," had rewritten the narrative retroactively. Even strong episodes were now treated as footnotes to an alleged fall. Henry Winkler's response to all of this has been unusually generous. Over the years, he has joked about the phrase, leaned into it, and even parodied it in later roles. He understands something many fans forget. A symbol does not erase history. Happy Days didn't stop mattering because of one scene. Fonzie didn't stop being iconic, but cultural shorthand doesn't care about complexity. Once a moment becomes metaphor, nuance disappears. What was ultimately lost was innocence, not just for the show, but for television storytelling itself. Happy Days began as a gentle escape, a world where cool didn't require escalation and heroism didn't require stunts. The shark jump didn't destroy that world, but it exposed how fragile it had become once success demanded spectacle instead of sincerity. And once that innocence was gone, there was no way to swim back. So here's the question. Do you think Fonzie really crossed a line that night? Or did the world simply decide it needed a moment to blame? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories about the moments that changed television forever.